I was raised Christian. My mom was on the worship team. We were in church every Sunday, but to my recollection, we didn't have a Bible in the house. I don't think I've read scripture in my home ever. I don't even know if we've ever prayed in our home growing up. It was like that routine Christian. Sundays are for the Lord and Monday through Saturday is for the flesh. You know what I mean? I was labeled as Christian, but I think as I got into my early teenage, late teenage years, I started questioning, like, do you actually believe in God? And I know this sounds drastic, but like, I would ask myself, like, gun to your head, are you confident you're going to heaven? Are you confident there's an afterlife? And as I really got older, towards 18, my answer was no. Like, absolutely not. And I had an overbearing fear of death. That was, I know that sounds kind of grim, but that was something I really struggled with that led to like hypochondria, with like medical illnesses. Like I always thought I was dying. And I think because I loved my life so much, God bless, I really didn't like the idea of dying. And I think it was largely predicated on the unsureness of what comes after. And that itself right there speaks for my faith or my lack thereof. Around 2021, I think I was more open to the idea of like revisiting my faith because that question had been answered of like, I don't believe in God. That's kind of a scary thought as someone who considered themselves Christian their whole life. I wasn't atheist. Like I'm not like anti-God. I hadn't read a bunch of like atheist books and such, but that was in my mind. And during the season, I was surrounded by a lot of really, really good Christians, and God bless my friends who are Christians for walking a Jesus-like life and just a beautiful faith that really was noticeable from the outside. I'd say that was the primary anchor that drove me to at least exploring faith more so, was that like there were these core people in my life and they were always such good people, not because they had to be, but because they wanted to be. It felt like the Spirit of God was just oozing out of them. Ironically, this is going to tie somehow back into you. I was listening to a podcast. I think the podcast, and I know where I was. I was on the freeway going through Palm Springs, and I think it was Bradley Martin's podcast. I think it was Raw Talk, and George was on it. There was something in this podcast. They were talking about tithing. When I was a kid, I always struggled with, or at least looking back now, I never related the Bible to my life. Like I didn't have the context as a young kid or the awareness to be like, oh, this scripture relates to this part of my life. It just wasn't in me. And so at that time, I really didn't believe in like kids going to church because I was like, I got nothing out of it. But what happened was tithing explained something that was happening in my life. Listening to that podcast, not only was I inspired by the way that George speaks about his faith in the Lord and especially Brad and the things he's been through, but tithing in specific was the first time that explained this phenomenon in my life that I had spoken about to so many people, which was money always finds its way to me in crazy ways. I was always somebody that gave behind the scenes and never gave for recognition. So many of my friends can vouch for this. I would always pay for people's food at dinner. I just loved serving with my money, and I never needed anything in exchange. It was just a part of my life. And so when I learned what tithing was, I was like, oh my goodness. I'm like, I've been tithing, and obviously God's been providing for me in my life, and that was kind of when I started realizing it. But tithing explained something I had experienced in my life. And so the more I dove into scripture and the more I was diving into my faith and these podcasts and having conversations with my Christian friends, all stemming from that podcast, I started being able to explain so many things that were happening in my life based on scripture. So instead of taking scripture and trying to relate it to my life was being explained by scripture. And then I had a really, really, really powerful conversation that just stemmed from a conversation about family and sort of that dynamic between me and my parents with two of my closest friends in the world, Kyle and Rebecca. I need to give them a shout out. God bless their hearts. They essentially asked to pray for me, and they were always super bold in their faith. And at this time, it was pretty like, it felt taboo in a way. It was a leap for me to go like, okay, yeah, like I'd love for you guys to pray for me, but it felt so sweet. My really, really good friend's wife would just randomly shoot me texts saying she's praying for me, you know, just the Spirit of God. And in this prayer, she and her husband had these like pictures of things that explained so much. Like I get the chills just talking about it in my past. And so in that moment, that day, I'd realized that the Lord had been a father to me. Again, I love my dad. I'm going to see him today, but he had been the father to me that I needed in my life. Not that my father wasn't a provider, a protector. All the times in my life and in my career when I felt like I was approaching rock bottom, I was always caught. And I was always caught by the Lord. And that was when that dynamic of like the Lord as a father really got ingrained into my brain. And ever since then, I've at least tried to just give everything to him because he's already done it for so long, and I didn't need anything from him anymore. I think a lot of people get into this transactional relationship with the Lord of like, if I do this, or if I'm obedient, or if this, then the Lord will this. But I'm like, I don't even need the Lord to do anything anymore. he's already done so much for me. Like, I'm so blessed. And I think that goes back to my perspective. Like, I've lived so much life, God willing, I'm 25 years old. Looking back at the patterns of where the Lord was in my life, I need nothing more from him. That's led me to today where, again, it's rhythmic and it's just like really getting ingrained in the trust I have and giving things to the Lord. And especially when I think that I know the way for me and it's like, no, the Lord has a plan and I need to be attentive to that.
Yeah.